You have probably heard the phrase, if you die in your dream, you die in real life. I have always been skeptical of this phrase. I've never thought that phrase was logical. How does a figment of your imagination cause your mortal self to die? I kept believing that a dream was a dream, and nothing in your dreams actually happened unless it was some sort of flashback. But that all changed when I decided to create my own sleep experiment. Because of that experiment, I now believe that it is possible to lose your life from a terrifying experience in your dream. Do you want to know my story? Go ahead. Read on. But you might regret knowing of my experience. I have always had a scientific mind. I analyzed everything and thought of other possibilities before I came to a conclusion. Thus, I was an honor roll student. Straight A's in all of my classes except gym. Boy, how I hated physical activity. Anyways, because of my highly inquisitive, scientific mind, I have always been a skeptic of many theories and superstitions. No matter how much proof there is to back up a theory, I know that eventually, there will be a factor that completely destroys that theory. You could say I'm a little crazy because Isaac Newton's laws of motion are extremely accurate, but that's just the way I see the world. So now you know why I don't believe how the phrase, if you die in your dreams, you die in real life, could possibly be logical. But of course, my scientific mind decided to test it. For 1 week, I decided to do nothing but watch horror films and read creepypasta to trigger paranoia and cause nightmares. Hopefully, I would trigger a nightmare that causes me to die, and eventually wake up, thus disproving that superstition. And so this experiment began. Sunday, June 3, 2012. So today, I spent over 10 hours watching classic horror films and reading creepypasta. I have to admit, the stories were quite unnerving, but I didn't find them that scary. However, before I went to sleep that night, I couldn't help but think that there was someone out there looking for me. I finally settled down and went to sleep. I woke up in a dark room that reeked of human decay. I was tied to a wooden slab, and I realized I could not even struggle. That's when I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. "Don't even bother struggling," the figure said, with a voice that sounded raspy and crazed. "I injected you with a serum that causes temporary paralysis." At this point, I was panicking. I kept trying to struggle even though I knew it wasn't possible because I was temporarily paralyzed. I kept trying and trying and trying, but it was no use. I was immobilized. That's when the figure turned towards me. He slowly moved forward and pulls out a knife, possibly getting ready to gut me alive. That's when I saw his face. I woke up. Unfortunately, I woke up before I could be killed in my nightmare. But I will never forget that nightmare. It was so lucid. It was almost like it was real, it felt too real. And that face was just so frightening. That figure had the eyes of a demon, they seemed to stare directly into your soul. His skin wasn't pale, like most psychotic murderers, but it was more blackened. It appeared as if his face was smeared with blackened makeup. But of course, it was all a dream, right? That thing couldn't possibly be real. At least that's what I thought. Monday, June 4, 2012. I spent another 10 hours watching horror films and reading creepypasta. All of it seemed very far-fetched. Especially Slender Man, who I knew could not possibly exist. And slasher films tend to over-exaggerate the psychopathic tendencies of murderers. However, that same feeling of paranoia continued to course through my veins. I still managed to settle down. This time, it was many years into the future. It was proven that there is life on other planets, and their technology was millions of years ahead of human technology. They decided to invade. Humanity was desperate. We ran frantically, hoping to gain shelter from the oncoming alien invasion. I kept hearing laser rifles being blasted everywhere, and I also kept hearing a droning sound, possibly the sounds coming from the extraterrestrials' vessels. To humanity's dismay, we were not safe. They had found us and captured every one of us. I blacked out, and woke up in what appeared to be a science laboratory. I saw many people being experimented on by the extraterrestrial beings. That's when I saw a bright white light. I woke up too early once again. So far, this experiment seems to be failing. I could never stay asleep to the point where whatever was coming at me would eventually kill me. Since this experiment lasted a week, and considering how lazy some people are when reading long stories, I've decided to cut out some of my journals and skip ahead to the final night of the experiment. After all, I don't think you the reader would want to read a week's worth of dream journals. Saturday, June 9, 2012. It's the final day of my experiment. I have spent 60 hours of my life watching horror films. Time to go for another 10. This time, however, I never felt that unnerved this time. Since I began doing this experiment, I have gradually become less and less freaked out by horror films and creepypasta. So falling asleep was easy this time. It was a bright summer day. I was hanging out with a bunch of friends, mainly playing games and talking about our lives. That night, we decided to dare each other into performing dastardly stunts. One of us jumped out of a third-story window, another prank called the vice principal of our school. When it was my turn, they decided to dare me to run through the local cemetery and back, and repeat this action 3 more times. So I ran through once, twice, 3 times, and that's when I blacked out. I woke up in the same dark room as the one in my first nightmare. I was tied up to that same wooden slab. The room still reeked of human decay. It didn't look much different from before. I also realized that I was able to move, well, hypothetically, because I was practically immobilized by being tied up to the wooden slab. So I began to struggle. My actions caught the attention of the same figure, who was standing next to what appeared to be a small laboratory. He turned towards me, staring me down with those same unnatural, demonic red eyes. "You woke up," he said, still using that crazed, fearsome rasp. "Too bad. I haven't finished the serum yet." I panicked. He was going to inject me with that same paralysis serum, thus suppressing my ability to struggle. I couldn't believe myself. I was still struggling to get free even though I knew it was no use. But I guess it's human nature to want to be free. That's when I felt a shock. He violently injected the needle into my neck. I screamed in agony as the syringe pierced my spine, allowing the serum to flow freely and disable my nervous system, completely immobilizing me. "Now, where were we?" he told himself, grabbing his cart of surgical tools. The last thing I heard was a demonic chuckle and the words, "Sweet dreams." Then I felt an extreme shock of pain through my chest as he stabbed me. I woke up. I was celebrating to myself because the experiment was successful. I managed to disprove the superstition that dying in your dreams makes you die in real life, at least that's what I thought. I felt a brief shock of pain through my chest. Then I noticed the rope burns around my wrists and ankles. I also felt serious pain on the back of my neck. But I never realized the vividness of my dream until I took a look at my chest, and right there was a giant scar, right above the location of the human heart. I'm running as fast as I can down the road ahead of me. It's a long gravel road, and as far as my eyes can see there is no end. I'm in heels. I've tripped and stumbled and nearly fallen countless times, but I can't risk stopping long enough to take them off. I can hear them behind me, chasing me. There are 3 of them. They are tall and fast, and they're each wearing the same black robes and mask. I don't know why they're chasing me, and I don't remember how it started. All I can remember is running. Suddenly I see another one, and he is coming toward me from the opposite direction. I begin to panic. I consider dashing into the trees on either side of the road, but surely I'd twist my ankle and be doomed. No, I must keep running. I must stay on this road and hope for the best. My heart thrashes wildly in my chest as I reach the figure, but he continues past me. A moment later I hear screaming behind me, and I can't help but to turn and look. He's attacked them. All three of my pursuers are lying motionlessly on the ground, presumably dead. I see no weapon, so I'm clueless as to how he's done it. I've stopped running now, and I stare wide-eyed as the figure approaches me. Thank you. I stammer nervously. The figure's breaths come loud and raspy through the hole at the mouth of their mask. We both stand still for what seems like an eternity before they finally respond. You wouldn't be thanking me if you knew what I looked like. I'm surprised at the voice. It's female. I watch curiously, and more than a little scared, as the figure raises her hand up to her mask and slowly removes it. I scream. This person has my face. Only it's been beaten and mangled. She has 2 black eyes, a bloody, broken nose, and a busted lip. What's going on here? I cry. She stares blankly at me. I couldn't let them do to you what they've done to the rest, she says. It's time for you to return, now. I open my mouth to demand a real answer, but then I start to feel very tired. I try to fight it, but I can't. I fall to the ground. I'm in a hospital bed when I wake up. I moan in pain because my head feels like it's splitting open, and my parents rush to my side. I hadn't noticed them. Sweetie, are you okay? My mother asks, taking my hand in hers and kissing me on the cheek. I shut my eyes and try to remember what happened. I had been watching the news. There was an interesting story going that people were mysteriously dying in their sleep. Not unusual for the elderly, but these were people my age. Autopsies repeatedly revealed that the victims were perfectly healthy. I must have fallen asleep. But that dream. It felt so real. So eerie. Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. I answer. What happened? My mother looks at my father, as if to ask him if he wants to take over. He shakes his head. No one really knows, dear, she tells me. You weren't answering my calls, so I got worried. I rushed over and used the spare key above the door to let myself in. I found you unconscious on your couch. You were holding this. She reaches into her purse and pulls out a mask. The mask for my dream. A blanket? I couldn't keep the tone out of my voice as I looked at the ratty patchwork quilt in my mother's arms. And that's supposed to help my situation, how? A security blanket. My mother corrected, but she seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then she stepped in close to brush my hair back. Her eyes, the same green as my own, flashed at the fresh bruises along my jaw, overlapping the older, yellowed bruises near my eye. It's been in our family for generations. It's helped me before, it'll help you too. I started to protest again as she pushed the blanket into my arms. Hush now. Just get a good night's rest with this. Sometimes a problem doesn't seem so bad after you've slept on it. With a gentle kiss on my unbeaten cheek, she turned and left my room. I eyed the blanket and sighed before spreading it over my bed. It was the weirdest looking quilt I'd ever seen, all the patches seemed random. There was a square of handsome red plaid, next to a really old faded piece of denim. There was even a square that looked like fur of some kind, and another faded scrap of flowery cloth. With a sigh I fell back on my bed and began touching the different squares, feeling the different textures. The blanket smelled good at least, like a combination of my mother and lavender. I suppose I did feel calmer, but I still didn't see how tomorrow would make things any better. I closed my eyes and thought about my situation. My situation. Trenton Hodge. He lived down the street from me and we both had to walk home along the same secluded dusty stretch next to the train tracks. He was a few years older and at first mostly just ignored me. Then he started walking home with friends, filming stupid stunts as they went. I guess the stunt videos weren't getting enough likes, because one day they started throwing rocks at me, calling names, the usual bully stuff. It must have given them what they were looking for because it escalated to taking my backpack, pushing me down, trying to humiliate me on camera any way they could. I didn't want to involve my mom. It's just me and her, and she's been picking up double shifts more frequently to get a bit ahead. If I told her about this, she'd have to get me a sitter or not be able to work late. I didn't want to do that to her. So, I tried to ignore them, then I tried to be friendly. I even tried running home ahead of them, but their legs were faster and stronger than mine. I dreaded the walk home. Then one day they weren't there. I hurried along the road, not wanting them to catch me. My stomach sank when I heard a giggle. Before I could turn around they'd grabbed me from behind and dragged me up onto the tracks. Trenton's friend filmed while they wrestled me to the ground with my arms behind my back. I tried to scream but Trenton's meaty hand shoved my face into the gravel between the tracks, hard. Trenton's friends laughed as Trenton put on an old-timey villain's voice, pinning me onto the tracks as he talked. "What the hell are you kids doing?" I heard a loud voice behind us exclaim. It was our neighbor, Mr. Roberts. Trenton scrambled off me, excuses tumbling out of his mouth as he hauled me up off the tracks. "We were just messing around with Tristan, right Tris?" Mr. Roberts didn't buy it for a second. He drove me home and when my mother got home told her what happened. She called the school, against my pleas. I watched as she spoke icily to the principal, fingering a small scar on her forehead. She only did that when she was really upset. The next day I heard that Trenton and his friends had been suspended. I stupidly hoped that might make them leave me alone. A few days went by and the bruises on my temple began to fade. My reprieve was short. Once they were back at school they came for their revenge. The beating they gave me was awful, but even scarier was the look in Trenton's eyes. Like he didn't want to stop. Finally, his friend stepped in and said I'd had enough. The look in his eyes promised more to come. They left me crumpled on the side of the road, cheering and whooping like victors as I cried hot tears of shame into the pavement. I shivered again at the memory and wrapped the quilt around me, cocooning myself in it. I drifted off to sleep thinking of my mother. I opened my eyes, then realized I was still dreaming. At least, I must have been. Only it wasn't like a dream I'd ever had before. I floated above my bed, staring down at myself wrapped loosely in the quilt. I saw myself mutter and roll to the side, the quilt slipping to the floor. I watched with fascination as the quilt began to move, all on its own. Slithering like a snake, it made its way to my open window and slipped out into the night. Attached, like a tethered balloon to a string, I followed. It was hard to spot in the dark grass, but for the bright red plaid square. I didn't understand how I could feel the cool night air on my arms, or smell the sweet grass in a dream, but I savored the sensations anyway as I watched the quilt slide smoothly over the ground while I swooped through the air above. It felt like pure freedom. Eventually I saw it stop and turn up a driveway. I felt my blood turn to ice as I realized we were at Trenton's house. I watched helplessly as the blanket wound its way up the eaves trough and into an open window. I floated in after it, frantically trying to figure out how to get it to come back outside. I gasped as I floated in the room after the blanket and realized we were in Trenton's bedroom. He snored loudly from his bed, dressed only in checkered pajama pants. The quilt silently slid onto the bed and draped over Trenton. "No, no, no," I screamed over and over in my head, terrified that he'd wake up and see me. Terrified that he'd hurt me again. It didn't matter that I was dreaming, and that none of this could be real. I didn't want to be anywhere near here. Anywhere near him. The quilt raised itself up and seemed to look back at me, then softly settled over Trenton's face. A few seconds passed, then he shifted under the quilt. Then shifted again. Then he began to thrash around under the quilt as it squeezed him tighter and tighter. Finally the limp cocoon that contained Trenton collapsed onto the bed and was still. Slowly, the quilt unwound itself from Trenton. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his eyes, blankly staring off into the distance. The quilt quickly slithered across the room and back out the window. Back in my room, my quilt crept across my room and settled across my sleeping form. For a horrible moment, I thought it was going to do the same thing to me that it did to Trenton. Instead, it snuggled gently against me. Against my will, I felt myself slide back down into darkness. The next morning when I woke there was a new square filled in on the quilt, with the exact pattern of Trenton's checkered pajama pants. "I think it's best if we both stay home today." My mother spoke softly, shattering our silent breakfast. I looked up at her, trying to see what she knew. We'd both heard the ambulance race past our house first thing this morning. After breakfast, she asked if I still needed the security blanket. I silently shook my head. She smiled and said, "I knew you were ready to use it wisely." Did you have to use it like I did?" She looked like she was about to cry, and rubbed the small scar on her forehead before replying softly, "Just once." We folded it up and carried it to the trunk in the attic where she stored it. When she opened the trunk I gasped. Inside was a jacket with the same bright red plaid as the quilt. I reached out to touch the material hesitantly and looked at her. She offered me back a sad smile. "That belonged to your father."